I thought I was the law, until the man I tried to destroy became the only reason I was still breathing that night. The courtroom smelled like polished wood and quiet judgment, the kind that settles into your lungs and stays there. And I stood at the prosecution table with my notes steady in my hand, even if my pulse wasn't, because this was everything I had worked for, every late night, every case, every promise I made to myself about justice meaning something real. And across from me sat Adrian Volkov, perfectly still, perfectly composed, like the entire system built to break men like him simply didn't apply, his dark suit immaculate, his expression unreadable, and when the judge called his name, he didn't flinch, didn't shift, didn't even blink. He just looked at me, not with anger, not with fear, but with something colder, something that made my breath catch for half a second too long, like he already knew how this would end and I didn't. And I told myself it was confidence, arrogance, the kind powerful men were like armor. But there was something else beneath it, something I couldn't name. And I hated that I couldn't name it, because I was supposed to understand people like him. I was supposed to break them down into evidence and motive and outcome, not stand there wondering why his silence felt louder than anything I was saying. And when I spoke, when I laid out the charges, my voice was clear, controlled, every word measured. I didn't rush, didn't hesitate. Because that's what control looks like in a room where everyone is watching, where every sentence can tip the scale. And still, he didn't react. Not when I described the damage his empire left behind. Not when I painted the picture the jury needed to see. He just watched me, like I was the one on trial, like he was waiting for me to understand something I hadn't even realized I was missing. And when the session adjourned and the room began to empty, the noise returning in low murmurs and footsteps echoing across marble floors, I gathered my files, steady hands, steady breath, telling myself I had done exactly what I came here to do, and then I felt it. That shift in the air, subtle but undeniable, like the moment before a storm breaks, and when I looked up, he was closer than he had any right to be, not touching, not threatening, just there, his presence filling the space in a way that made everything else feel distant, irrelevant, and his voice when he spoke was low, controlled, almost quiet enough to miss if you weren't listening for it. "You should be careful tonight," he said, like it wasn't a warning, like it wasn't anything at all, just a passing observation. And I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding, straightened my shoulders, met his gaze without backing down, because that's what you do when someone like him tries to unsettle you. You don't give them the satisfaction. "Is that a threat?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended, and for the first time, something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, not quite anything I could define, just enough to make my chest tighten. "No," he said, his eyes never leaving mine. "It's the opposite." And then he stepped back, just like that, the moment gone, swallowed by the noise of the courthouse and the movement of people who had no idea that something had just changed, something small and invisible and impossible to explain. And I told myself it meant nothing, that he was playing a game I refused to play, that I was in control here, that I knew exactly who the enemy was. But as I walked out into the fading light of late afternoon, the sky heavy with clouds and the air carrying that same quiet tension, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just stepped into something much bigger than a case, something that had nothing to do with guilt or innocence, and everything to do with survival. I should have gone straight home. That is what every instinct said as I stepped out of the courthouse and into the cool evening air. But instincts are easy to ignore when you believe you are in control, when you believe the world still follows rules you understand, and I did. I believed that with a certainty that felt almost comforting, because the alternative was admitting that a man like Adrian Volkov could walk into my life, say a single sentence, and make me question everything I thought I knew. So I pushed it aside, tightened my grip on my bag, and started toward the parking structure 2 blocks away, the sound of my heels echoing against the pavement in a rhythm that felt too loud in the quiet. The sky above me dimming into that deep blue that comes just before night fully settles, streetlights flickering on one by one, casting long shadows that stretched across the concrete like something reaching, and I told myself it was nothing, just another late day, just another case, just another walk to my car. But the feeling did not leave. It stayed just beneath my skin, a subtle tension, like being watched without ever seeing who was doing the watching. And I hated that feeling more than anything, because it made me feel uncertain, and uncertainty was something I had trained myself out of a long time ago. I reached the entrance of the parking garage and paused for half a second, just long enough to notice how quiet it was, how the usual hum of engines and distant voices was missing, replaced by a stillness that felt heavier than it should, and then I kept moving, because stopping would mean acknowledging that something was wrong, and I was not ready to do that. Not yet. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed softly, casting a pale glow over rows of parked cars. My footsteps slower now, more measured, my senses sharper in a way I could not quite explain, and then I heard it. Not a sound exactly, more like a shift, a presence, something behind me that had not been there a second ago. My breath caught, my fingers tightening around my keys as I turned slightly, just enough to glance over my shoulder without fully stopping. Nothing. Just empty space and concrete pillars and silence stretching too far, too wide. I exhaled slowly, forcing my shoulders to relax, telling myself again that this was nothing, that I was letting one strange comment get into my head, that I was smarter than this, stronger than this, and I kept walking, faster now, my car only a few yards ahead, the familiar shape of it grounding me for a moment, until the air shifted again, sharper this time, undeniable. And before I could fully process it, before I could even turn, a voice cut through the silence, low, controlled, unmistakable. Do not move. And everything in me froze, not out of fear, not entirely, but out of recognition, because I knew that voice. I had heard it just hours ago in a courtroom filled with light and certainty, and now it sounded different, closer, more urgent, like something had changed in the space between then and now. My heart began to race, my breath shallow as I stood there, caught between instinct and logic, between the version of the world I understood and the one that was unfolding around me. You followed me, I said, the words coming out steadier than I felt, because that was easier to believe. Easier than anything else this moment might mean. A pause, brief but heavy, and then his reply, softer this time, but no less firm. No, he said. And I could almost feel the weight of his gaze without turning. I got here before they did. And in that instant, something inside me shifted, something quiet but irreversible, because for the first time since this case began, I realized that I might not be standing on the side I thought I was, and the man I had been so certain was the danger might be the only one who actually saw it coming. I did not turn around immediately because turning would make it real, and I was not ready for that yet. Not ready to accept that the man I had stood against in court was now standing somewhere behind me in a dark parking garage telling me not to move like my life depended on it, which made no sense. None of this made sense. And yet my body listened before my mind could argue, my feet rooted to the concrete, my breath shallow as I stared at the dull reflection of my car window ahead, trying to catch even the smallest hint of movement behind me. But all I saw was myself, pale under the fluorescent lights, eyes wider than I wanted them to be. Who are they? I asked quietly, because if I focused on questions then maybe I would not have to focus on the way the air felt heavier, tighter, like the space itself was closing in. There was a pause behind me, controlled, measured, like he was deciding how much to say. And then his voice again, closer now, lower. Not the kind of people you can reason with, he said, and something in the way he said it made my stomach tighten. Not fear exactly. Something sharper, more precise, like understanding beginning to form where denial used to be. I swallowed, forcing my voice steady. And you can, I said, because I needed that to be true, needed him to still fit into the version of the world I understood, where men like him were the problem, not the solution. Another pause, shorter this time, and then, I know how they think, he replied. And that was not an answer, not really, but it was enough to make me realize this was not a game, not intimidation, not anything I had prepared for. My grip tightened around my keys, the metal pressing into my palm grounding me just enough to keep my thoughts from spiraling. You expect me to trust you, I said, and this time I turned, slowly, deliberately, because if I was going to face this, I was going to do it on my terms, and there he was, exactly where I knew he would be, a few feet away, perfectly still. His dark coat blending into the shadows, his eyes locked on mine with an intensity that made everything else fade for a second, and for the first time since I met him, he did not look untouchable. He looked focused, sharp, like every detail in this moment mattered. "No," he said simply, and the honesty in that single word caught me off guard more than anything else could have. "I expect you to listen," he added, and something about that, about the lack of control in his tone, made my chest tighten in a way I did not understand, because he was not trying to dominate the situation, he was trying to manage it, and that was different, dangerously different. I opened my mouth to respond, to argue, to reassert the balance I felt slipping, but before I could, a distant sound echoed through the structure, faint but enough to shift his attention for half a second, his gaze flicking past me, calculating, precise, and then back to me, sharper than before. "Get in your car," he said. The words firm now, leaving no room for debate, and something in my chest resisted. Immediately, because I did not take orders, not from him, not from anyone, but my body hesitated, caught between pride and instinct, and in that hesitation, I saw it. Not clearly, not fully, but enough. A shadow moving where there should not have been movement, a presence that did not belong, and suddenly his warning did not feel like a tactic anymore. It felt like the only thing keeping me from stepping into something I could not see, something I could not predict, and for the first time since this all began, I realized that whatever line I thought separated right from wrong, safe from dangerous, had already been crossed, and I had not even seen it happen. I should have argued. That is what I do. That is who I am. I question. I push. I do not take instructions from men who operate outside the law, but something in the way he said it, not louder, not harsher, just certain, cut through that instinct before it could fully form, and for a second I hated that. Hated the way my body reacted before my mind could catch up, hated that I was even considering listening to him. "You do not get to tell me what to do," I said anyway, because I needed to hear myself say it. Needed to feel like I still had control over something, anything. But he did not react the way I expected, did not step closer, did not challenge me. He just watched me, steady and unshaken, like my resistance was already calculated into whatever this was. "Then do not," he said quietly. And that should have made it easier to ignore him, should have made it simple to turn, unlock my car, and leave like nothing had changed, but it did not, because now the choice was mine, and that made it heavier, made it real in a way that no command ever could. I glanced past him, scanning the rows of concrete and shadow, and there it was again, that subtle shift, a presence that did not belong, not obvious, not clear, just wrong in a way my instincts refused to ignore. My pulse picked up, faster now, sharper, and I hated that too. Hated that I could feel it building without understanding what exactly I was reacting to. "You said they," I murmured, my voice lower now, more controlled. "Who are they?" And this time he did not hesitate, did not soften the answer. "People who do not want you to finish that case," he said, and the words landed heavier than anything else he had said so far, because that, at least, I understood, that fit into a world I knew. Threats, pressure, intimidation. It was not new. It was part of the system whether anyone admitted it or not. But this felt different, because of where we were, because of how quiet it was, because of the way he was standing there like he had already mapped out every possible outcome. "That is not new," I said, trying to ground myself in logic. "I have handled worse." And again, that almost smile, not mocking, not impressed. Just there for a fraction of a second before it disappeared. "No," he said, his gaze locking onto mine with a weight that made it hard to look away. "You have not," and something in my chest tightened at that. Not fear, not exactly, something closer to realization, like a piece of the puzzle shifting into place whether I wanted it to or not. The distant sound came again, closer this time, subtle but enough, and I saw it more clearly now, movement between the pillars, not random. Not uncertain, deliberate, and suddenly the garage did not feel like an open space anymore. It felt like something narrowing, closing in from angles I had not considered. I inhaled slowly, forcing my thoughts into order, forcing myself to choose, because standing still was no longer an option. Not here, not now. And when I looked back at him, really looked this time, I saw it. Not just control, not just calculation, but urgency. Carefully contained but unmistakable, and that was the moment. Everything shifted, because men like Adrian Volkov did not show urgency unless it mattered, unless something was already in motion that could not be undone. "If I get in that car," I said slowly, each word measured. You explain everything. And for a fraction of a second, something unreadable crossed his expression, something that almost looked like surprise, before it settled back into that same controlled stillness. I will explain enough, he replied, and it was not a promise, not really. But it was the closest thing I was going to get, and for reasons I could not fully justify. That was enough. I reached for the handle, the cool metal grounding me as I pulled the door open, and just before I stepped inside, I glanced back once more, because I needed to see it. Clearly, needed to confirm that this was not in my head. And there it was, no longer just a shadow, no longer uncertain, a figure stepping into the edge of the light, not rushing, not hiding, just watching, waiting, like whatever this was had already been set in motion long before I ever walked into that courtroom. And as I slid into the driver's seat, one thought cut through everything else, sharp and undeniable. I was never supposed to win that case. I was supposed to walk straight into this. I slammed the door shut harder than I meant to, the sound echoing through the garage like a line I could not uncross, my hands gripping the steering wheel even though I had not started the engine yet, my breath uneven as everything I thought I understood began to shift into something unrecognizable. And before I could say anything, before I could demand answers the way I always did, he was already moving, circling the front of the car with that same controlled precision, opening the passenger door and sliding in like he had done this 1,000 times. Like this was just another calculated move in a game I did not even know I was part of. The door shut with a quiet finality, and for a second neither of us spoke, the silence thick, charged, filled with everything unspoken between us. Start the car, he said, not looking at me, his eyes scanning the mirrors, the shadows beyond the glass. Always aware, always 2 steps ahead, and I hesitated, just for a second, because this was the moment, the point where I could still walk away, still choose to believe in the version of reality I had built my life on. But then I saw it again, that movement behind us, clearer now, closer, and something in my chest tightened, sharp and immediate. And I turned the key, the engine coming to life beneath my hands, grounding, familiar, real, drive, he added. And this time I did not argue, did not push back. I pressed my foot to the gas and pulled out of the space, my eyes flicking to the rearview mirror, catching a glimpse of figures emerging from the shadows, not rushing, not chaotic, just steady, deliberate, like they had all the time in the world, and that scared me more than anything else could have. Because it meant this was planned, not random, not reactive, planned. Left, he said calmly, and I followed without thinking, turning onto the ramp that led out of the structure, my pulse loud in my ears, every second stretching longer than it should. Now explain, I said, my voice tighter than I wanted it to be, because if I did not anchor myself in questions, I was going to start feeling things I was not ready to feel. You said they do not want me to finish the case. Who exactly am I dealing with? And for the first time since he got in the car, he looked at me, really looked, his gaze sharp, assessing, like he was deciding how much truth I could handle. The same people who made sure you got assigned to me, he said, and the words hit harder than anything else tonight, because that was not possible. Cases did not just get assigned randomly. There were processes, structures, rules. That is not how it works. I said immediately, shaking my head, because I needed that to be wrong, needed something to still make sense, but he did not argue, did not raise his voice. He just held my gaze for a second longer before looking back ahead. That is exactly how it works when someone higher decides it should, he replied, and something cold settled in my chest at that, something quiet but heavy, like the ground beneath everything I believed was starting to crack. I tightened my grip on the wheel. The city lights ahead coming into view as we exited the garage, the open street, feeling both like relief and exposure at the same time. Why me? I asked, softer now, because that was the question that mattered, not the case, not him. Me? Why me? And for a moment he did not answer, the silence stretching between us as the car moved forward into the night, until finally, he spoke, his voice lower than before, almost thoughtful. Because you are exactly what they needed, he said, and I felt my stomach drop at the way he said it. Not accusing, not dismissive, just certain. Someone who believes in the system enough not to question it until it is too late. And I swallowed, my throat suddenly dry, because that sounded too close to the truth, too close to something I had Never allowed myself to consider. And what happens now? I asked, my eyes fixed on the road but my mind somewhere else entirely. And this time when he answered, there was no hesitation at all. Now, he said, his gaze steady, unyielding. You stop being the prosecutor in this story, and my breath caught, just for a second, as the weight of that settled in, and you start surviving it. The word surviving echoed in my head longer than it should have, louder than the sound of the engine, louder than the city outside my window, because it did not belong to my world, not the one I had built, not the one where laws were followed and justice had a process. And yet here I was, driving through downtown streets with a man I had just stood against in court, listening to him talk about survival like it was the only thing that mattered, like everything else had already been decided. You expect me to just disappear? I said after a moment, my voice steadier now, sharper, because if I let fear take over then I would lose the only advantage I had left, my clarity, and I refused to lose that. Not to him, not to this situation. He did not answer immediately, his gaze fixed ahead, tracking every car, every intersection, every reflection in the glass like he was reading a language I did not understand. No, he said finally, calm, certain. I expect you to adapt, and I let out a quiet breath at that, because somehow that was worse. Disappearing meant giving up. Adapting meant accepting that everything he was saying might be true, that the system I trusted could be manipulated in ways I had never considered. You are asking me to believe that the case, my entire case, was set up, I said, my fingers tightening slightly around the wheel, that I was placed there intentionally. And this time he nodded, just once, like it was the simplest fact in the world. You were chosen because you would not question it, he said, and there was no accusation in his tone, no judgment, just a statement that landed heavier than anything else tonight. I shook my head, a small movement, instinctive, because rejecting it was easier than accepting what it implied. That is not enough, I said. There has to be a reason, a specific reason. And for the first time, he leaned back slightly in his seat, his expression shifting, not softer, but more deliberate, like he was choosing his next words carefully. There is, he said. You are clean. And I frowned at that, confusion cutting through the tension. Clean, I repeated, and he nodded again. No ties, no leverage, no history they can use against you, he explained, which makes you credible, untouchable, and completely predictable. And something about that made my chest tighten, not because it was flattering, but because of what it meant, that everything I had worked to become, everything I had taken pride in, could be used as a tool without my knowledge. Predictable, I echoed quietly. And this time there was the faintest shift in his expression, something that almost looked like understanding. You believe in the system, he said, and I could not argue with that, because I did. Or at least I had, until tonight, until this moment, until I started seeing the cracks in something I had always assumed was solid. I exhaled slowly, my eyes flicking to the rearview mirror again out of habit, the empty street behind us offering no answers, no reassurance, just more questions. So what now? I asked, my voice quieter now, not weaker, just more focused, because if I was going to stay in this, if I was going to survive it, then I needed to understand the rules, even if they were different from the ones I knew. And this time when he answered, his voice carried something new, not urgency, not control, something closer to resolve. Now you stop looking at this like a case, he said, and you start looking at it like a pattern. And I frowned slightly at that, my mind already trying to piece it together. A pattern of what? I asked, and he turned his head just enough to meet my gaze, his eyes steady, unflinching. Of people who disappear when they get too close to the truth, he said, and the words settled into the space between us, quiet but heavy. And for the first time since this began, I did not try to argue, did not try to push back, because something inside me had already started to shift, already started to see the edges of what he was describing, and I realized, with a clarity that felt both terrifying and undeniable, that I was no longer trying to prove him wrong. I was trying to understand how deep this actually went. I kept driving even after the city thinned out, even after the traffic lights grew farther apart, and the noise of downtown faded into something quieter, because stopping felt like surrender, and I was not ready to do that yet. Not when every word he had said was still echoing in my head. Pattern, disappearance, chosen. the pieces circling without fully connecting, and I hated that feeling. Hated not having control over the narrative, over the facts, over anything. If there is a pattern, I said, finally, breaking the silence that had stretched too long between us, then there are records, cases, names, something I can verify, because that is how this works. That is how it always works. Evidence, documentation, proof. I needed something concrete, something I could hold on to before everything slipped too far out of reach. And for a moment I thought he would dismiss it, tell me it was not that simple. But instead he nodded slightly, like he had been waiting for me to ask that question. There were others, he said, his voice even, controlled, before you. And something in my chest tightened at that. Because of course there were. There are always others. But the way he said it made it feel different, heavier, like those others were not just names on a file. What happened to them? I asked, my grip tightening on the wheel again. And this time he did not answer immediately, his gaze shifting to the side window, watching the passing lights like he was measuring time itself. They stopped asking questions, he said finally, and I frowned at that, frustration rising quickly. That is not an answer. I pushed, sharper now, because I needed clarity, not vague warnings, not half-truths. It is the only answer that matters, he replied, turning his attention back to me. And there was something in his eyes this time that I had not seen before, not distance, not calculation, something closer to certainty, the kind that comes from experience, not assumption, and that unsettled me more than anything else tonight, because it meant he was not guessing, he knew. You were saying they were forced to stop, I said, trying to translate what he was not saying. Directly, trying to force it into something I could understand, and again, that pause, that careful selection of words. I am saying they did not continue. He corrected, and that was worse, because it left too much open, too much undefined, my mind filling in possibilities I was not ready to consider. I exhaled slowly, forcing myself to focus, to stay grounded in logic. Then we find them, I said, more to myself than to him. Because that is what you do when something does not make sense, you trace it back. You follow the line until you reach the origin. And for the first time since we left the garage, something in his posture shifted, not relaxed, but altered, like I had just stepped into territory he had not expected me to reach so quickly. You are not hearing me, he said quietly, and I shook my head, a small, stubborn movement. No, you are not hearing me. I countered, my voice steadier now, more certain, because this was familiar ground, investigation, process, action. If there is a pattern, then it can be broken. And I meant that. I believed it. Even now. Even with everything unraveling around me. Because that belief was the only thing keeping me from losing myself completely. He studied me for a long second, his gaze searching, assessing, like he was seeing something he had not accounted for. And then he looked away, a subtle shift. But enough. That is why they chose you, he said, almost to himself. And something about that sent a quiet chill through me. Not because of what he said, but because of how he said it. Like he was realizing something at the same time I was, something neither of us had fully understood before. I swallowed, my eyes returning to the road, the dark stretch ahead suddenly feeling longer than it should. And what about you? I asked after a moment, the question forming before I could stop it. If they wanted me in this position, where do you fit into all of this? And when I glanced at him, really looked this time, I saw it. Not just control, not just knowledge, but something else, something deeper, something that had nothing to do with the case and everything to do with why he was here, why he had warned me, why he had stepped into this. At all. And when he finally answered, his voice was quieter than before, almost reflective. I was never supposed to keep you alive, he said, and the words settled into the silence between us like something irreversible, something that changed the direction of everything that came next. The words stayed with me longer than anything else he had said that night, not because they were louder or more dramatic, but because they were quiet, controlled, almost detached, like he was stating a fact that had already been decided long before I ever entered the picture. And I felt something shift inside me at that, something subtle but undeniable, because this was no longer just about a case or a pattern or even survival. It was about intention, about roles that had been assigned without my knowledge, without my consent. What does that mean? I asked, my voice lower now, steadier, because I needed clarity more than I needed comfort. And he did not answer immediately, his gaze fixed on the road ahead, the passing streetlights casting brief shadows across his face, revealing nothing, hiding everything, until finally he exhaled slowly, like he had been holding something back. "It means," he said, choosing each word carefully, "that tonight was not supposed to end with you driving away." And my grip on the wheel tightened instinctively, my mind catching up to the implication before I could stop it, before I could push it away. "And you changed that," I said, not a question, because it was already obvious, already written into everything that had happened since I stepped out of that courthouse. And this time when he glanced at me, there was something different in his expression, not uncertainty, not regret, something closer to acknowledgement, like he understood exactly what that decision had cost. "Yes," he said simply, and the weight of that single word settled into the space between us, heavier than anything else, because choices like that do not exist in isolation. They shift everything around them. They redraw lines you did not even know were there. I swallowed, my thoughts racing, trying to find something solid, something I could still hold on to. "Why?" I asked, because that was the only question that mattered now. Not the case, not the pattern, not even the danger, just that one word. Why? And for a moment I thought he would deflect, avoid it the way he had avoided other answers. But he did not. He looked at me directly, his gaze steady, unguarded in a way I had not seen before. And when he spoke, his voice was quieter than it had been all night. "Because you were not supposed to see it," he said, and I frowned slightly, confusion cutting through the tension again. "See what?" I pressed, and this time he did not hesitate at all. "The way it actually works," he replied, and something in my chest tightened at that, because I had spent years believing I understood how things worked, believing I was part of something structured, something just, something real, and now that belief felt thinner, more fragile, like it could break if I pushed too hard. "And now that I have," I said slowly, my voice almost a whisper, "what happens to me?" And there it was again, that pause, that careful calculation, but this time it felt different, less about what he was willing to say and more about what he could not change. "Now," he said, finally, his eyes returning to the road, his voice steady again, controlled. "You become a problem." And the words landed with a clarity that left no room for interpretation, no space to soften their meaning. And for a second, just a second, everything inside me went completely still, not fear, not panic, just silence, the kind that comes when something shifts so fundamentally that your mind needs a moment to catch up, to process what it means. And then the world rushed back in all at once, the sound of the engine, the passing lights, the weight of his words settling deeper with every second, and I realized, with a certainty that felt both terrifying and undeniable, that there was no going back to the version of my life that existed before tonight, no returning to the courtroom where everything made sense, because that world had already been stripped away, piece by piece, until all that remained was this, a car moving through the dark, a man I was supposed to destroy sitting beside me, and the quiet understanding that whatever came next, I was no longer standing on the side of control. I was standing in the middle of something much bigger than I had ever imagined. And for the first time since this all began, I was not trying to fight it. I was trying to understand how far it would go. Becoming a problem was not something they taught you how to handle in law school. There were no textbooks for it, no procedures, no carefully outlined steps to follow when the system you trusted quietly decided you no longer fit inside it. And yet the word stayed with me. Problem, simple, cold, precise, like something that could be solved if the right people applied enough pressure. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel, forcing myself to stay present, to focus on what I could still control. The road, the speed, the direction, even if everything else had already started slipping beyond my reach. "Then I fix it," I said after a moment, my voice steady despite the weight pressing against my chest, because that was still my instinct. Identify the issue, find the solution, restore order. Adrian turned his head slightly, just enough to look at me, and there it was again, that quiet shift in his expression, not disbelief, not amusement, something closer to recognition, like he had expected that answer even before I spoke. "You cannot fix something you do not understand," he said, and I exhaled slowly at that, because he was right, and I hated that he was right. "Then help me understand it," I replied, my tone sharper now, more deliberate, because if I was going to stay in this, if I was going to survive it, Then I needed more than fragments and warnings. I needed structure. I needed truth. He did not respond immediately, his gaze returning to the road ahead, the city, stretching out in front of us, quieter now, darker, like we were moving further away from something familiar and into something else entirely. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried a different weight, less guarded, more direct. "This was never about putting me in prison," he said, and I felt my breath catch slightly at that, not because it was surprising, but because hearing it confirmed everything I had been trying to deny. "Then what was it about?" I asked, my voice lower now, more focused, and this time there was no pause, no hesitation. "It was about control," he said, removing one variable and testing another. And the words settled heavily in my mind, reshaping everything I thought I knew about the case, about my role in it, about him. "You are saying I was the test," I said slowly, piecing it together as I spoke, and he nodded once. "They needed to see how far you would go," he confirmed, and something inside me tightened at that, because it meant my choices, my actions, everything I believed was independent, had been observed, measured, evaluated without my knowledge, and now they have their answer. I said quietly, more to myself than to him, and he did not correct me, did not soften it, which told me everything I needed to know. Silence filled the car again, but it felt different now, heavier, more defined, like the space between us was no longer filled with uncertainty, but with something clearer, more dangerous. I glanced at him, really looked this time, at the man I had stood against just hours ago, the man I had believed was the center of everything wrong with this case. And now he felt like the only piece that actually made sense. "Why are you telling me all of this?" I asked, because that question had been sitting just beneath everything else, waiting for the moment I could no longer ignore it. "You could have let it happen," I added, my voice quieter now, more honest than I intended. And this time when he looked at me, there was no calculation, no distance, just a steady, unwavering focus that made it impossible to look away. "I did not want to see what happens when someone like you disappears," he said, and the words landed differently then. Everything else he had said, not as a warning, not as a strategy, but as something else entirely, something that made my chest tighten in a way I could not explain. I swallowed, my thoughts slowing, shifting, because for the first time since this began, this was no longer just about survival or truth or control. It was about choice, his, mine, and whatever came next. And as the road stretched out ahead of us, darker, quieter, leading somewhere I had never planned to go, I realized that the line between enemy and ally had already blurred beyond recognition. And the only thing I was certain of now was this: the man I was supposed to destroy was the only one who had chosen not to. His words did not leave me. They stayed in the quiet space between us, shaping everything that came after. Because choice changes things. It shifts the balance in ways you cannot always see at first, and I felt that shift now, subtle but undeniable, as the car moved through streets that felt unfamiliar even though I had driven them 100 times before. "Then we changed the outcome," I said after a long moment, my voice steady again, grounded in something that felt like purpose rather than fear, because if this was a game, if this was control, then it could still be disrupted, still be redirected. That was how systems worked. They adapted, and so could I. Adrian glanced at me briefly, not dismissing, not encouraging, just observing, like he was measuring the weight of that statement. "You still think this ends with you winning?" he said, and it was not a question, just a quiet acknowledgement of how I saw the world. I shook my head slightly, my eyes fixed on the road ahead. "No," I replied, "I think this ends with me understanding." And that felt different, not victory, not defeat. Something else entirely, something more dangerous, because understanding means you see things you cannot unsee, and he seemed to recognize that. The faintest shift in his posture, like something in my answer, had altered the way he was looking at me. "Then you need to stop driving toward anything predictable," he said, and I frowned slightly at that, adjusting my grip on the wheel. "What does that mean?" I asked, and he nodded toward the next intersection. "Take a right," he instructed, and I followed without hesitation, the car turning onto a narrower street, quieter, darker, the kind of place that does not draw attention. "It means they expect you to go home," he continued, "or somewhere familiar, somewhere they can anticipate." And I felt a slow realization settle in as he spoke, because he was right. Of course he was right. Patterns are built on predictability, and I had been nothing if not predictable. Up until now, so we break the pattern, I said quietly, more to myself than to him. And this time he did not correct me, did not challenge it, which told me I was finally starting to see what he had been trying to show me since the beginning. We drove in silence for a few minutes. After that, the city shifting around us, buildings changing, lights thinning, the familiar giving way to something less defined, and I could feel it, the transition, not just in the environment but in myself, like I was stepping further away from the version of my life that had existed before tonight. Where are we going? I asked eventually, my voice calmer now, more controlled, and he leaned back slightly in his seat, his gaze still alert, still tracking everything around us. Somewhere they are not watching yet, he said, and that word yet lingered in the air, because it meant this was temporary. This was not escape, it was delay, and I understood that without needing him to explain it further. And after that, I asked, because delay is not enough. Not if you want to survive something like this. And he turned his head just enough to meet my eyes again, his expression steady, unchanging. After that, he said, we make them look in the wrong direction. And something about that sent a quiet spark through me. Not fear, not relief, something closer to clarity. Because for the first time since this began, there was a strategy forming, not just reaction, not just survival, but movement, deliberate, calculated, and I felt it settle into place, that shift from being pulled into something to actively stepping into it. And as the road stretched out ahead of us, darker and more uncertain than anything I had planned for, I realized that I was no longer just trying to understand the game, I was starting to play it. The moment you decide to play the game, you stop being allowed to make mistakes, and I felt that settle into my chest as we turned onto a narrow side street lined with buildings that looked abandoned at first glance, but were not. Not really, because nothing in a city like this is ever truly empty. It is just hidden, layered, waiting, and I slowed the car as Adrian lifted a hand slightly, a silent signal. Pull in there, he said, nodding toward a dimly lit entrance that looked like it had not been used in years, and I hesitated for half a second before turning the wheel, guiding the car into the shadowed space, the tires crunching softly against gravel instead of pavement, the shift in sound grounding me in a way I did not expect, the engine idling as I brought the car to a stop, and for a moment neither of us moved, the silence heavier now, more deliberate, like this place existed outside the pattern he had been talking about. We are not staying long, he said, already reaching for the door handle, and I turned to him slightly, my mind catching up to the shift in pace. Then why stop at all? I asked, because every second we were still felt like a risk, and he paused, just enough to meet my gaze. Because you need to see it, he replied, and something in his tone made my chest tighten. Not fear, not exactly, something closer to anticipation, like whatever came next was going to change the way I understood everything else. He stepped out of the car, and I followed a second later, the cool air hitting my skin as I closed the door behind me. The quiet here different from the garage, not tense, not watching, just still, like a pause between movements. He walked ahead without looking back, his pace steady, confident, like he had been here before, and I stayed close, my eyes scanning the surroundings instinctively, every shadow, every angle, trying to read the space the way he seemed to. We moved toward a side door half hidden behind a concrete pillar, and when he pushed it open, the faint glow of light spilled out into the darkness, revealing a narrow corridor beyond. What is this place? I asked quietly, stepping inside after him. The air cooler here, quieter, insulated from the outside world in a way that made it feel disconnected from everything we had just left behind. A gap, he said, his voice echoing softly against the walls, and I frowned slightly at that. A gap in what? I pressed, because I was done accepting answers that did not fully explain themselves, and he glanced back at me briefly, his expression unreadable but focused. In their visibility, he said, and that made more sense than I wanted it to, because if they were watching patterns, then places like this, places that did not fit into expected routes or routines, would be invisible to them, at least for now. We walked further down the corridor until it opened into a larger room, dimly lit, but not abandoned, not forgotten. There were screens, equipment, traces of something organized, intentional, and I slowed slightly, taking it in, the realization forming before I could stop it. You have been preparing for this, I said, my voice quieter now, more certain, and he did not deny it, did not confirm it directly either. He just turned to face me fully, his gaze steady. I have been preparing for something, he corrected, and that distinction mattered, because it meant this was bigger than me, bigger than the case, bigger than tonight. I took a slow breath, my thoughts aligning in a way they had not before, because for the first time since this began, I was not just reacting, I was stepping into a space where things had already been set in motion long before I arrived. And as I looked at him, really looked this time, I realized something that changed everything again. I was not the only one who had been chosen for this. He had been too, just in a very different way. The realization did not come all at once. It unfolded slowly, piece by piece, like something my mind had been resisting finally, deciding to surface whether I was ready or not. Because standing in that room, surrounded by screens that quietly monitored patterns I had never noticed, I understood something I had been avoiding since the moment he stepped into my case. This was never random, not for me, not for him, not for any of it. You knew this was coming, I said, my voice steady but lower now, more grounded in understanding than accusation, and he did not look surprised by the question, did not deflect it. He just watched me for a second like he was measuring how much I had already figured out on my own. I knew something was building, he replied, and that distinction mattered, because it meant even he had not seen the full picture until now, but not me. I added, because that part still needed to be said, still needed to be understood, and this time his expression shifted, just slightly, enough to acknowledge the truth in that, not you, he confirmed, and the honesty in that answer did not make it easier to accept. If anything, it made it heavier, because it meant I had not just been placed into this. I had been selected without anyone expecting me to see it, to question it, to survive it. I turned away for a moment, my eyes landing on one of the screens, data moving in quiet patterns, routes, timestamps, fragments of something larger that I was only beginning to understand. You said they were watching patterns, I said slowly, my thoughts aligning as I spoke. Routes, habits, decisions. And he nodded once, silent confirmation. Then they are watching for me to react the way I always do. I continued, the realization sharpening with every word. To follow procedure, to report this, to go somewhere official, somewhere visible. And now when I looked back at him, I saw it, that shift again, not surprise, not quite approval, something closer to recognition, like I had finally stepped fully into the role he had been trying to pull me toward since the beginning. Yes, he said simply, and something inside me settled at that. Not relief, not comfort, something stronger, something more precise, clarity, because for the first time since this began, I was not trying to force this situation into the framework I understood. I was adapting to the one that actually existed. Then we give them exactly that, I said, and his gaze sharpened immediately, locking on a mind with a focus that told me I had his full attention now. You want to be predictable, he said, not as a question, but as a realization forming alongside mine. And I nodded slightly, my pulse steady now, my thoughts clear in a way they had not been before. No, I corrected. I want them to think I am. And the difference mattered, because perception is a pattern too, one that can be shaped, redirected, manipulated just like any other. He watched me for a long second after that, the silence between us no longer uncertain, but charged with something else entirely, alignment. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried that same shift, less guarded, more direct. If you do that, he said, you stop being the variable they control. And I felt that settle into place. Firm, undeniable, because that was the point, not to escape, not to disappear, but to step outside the version of myself they had already mapped out. I took a slow breath, my eyes returning to the screens, the data, the quiet evidence of something much larger than a single case, a single night, a single decision. Then, we changed the pattern, I said, and this time there was no hesitation, no uncertainty, just intention, and when I glanced back at him, I saw it clearly, not just the man I had once stood against, but the only person in this entire system who had already learned how to move outside of it. And for the first time since all of this began, I understood exactly what that meant. I was not just trying to survive anymore. I was becoming something they had not planned for. The moment you stop reacting is the moment you take control, and I felt that settle into me as I stood in that dimly lit room. No longer the person who walked into the courthouse that morning, no longer the version of myself they had expected to follow every rule, every step, every predictable move. I looked at the screens one last time before turning away, because I understood now. This was never about one case or one man. It was about a system that relied on people like me to stay inside the lines it quietly drew. And the second you stepped outside of them, you became something else entirely, something they could not measure, something they could not easily control. So this is where it changes, I said, more to myself than to him. But he heard it anyway. He always did. And when I met his gaze, there was no distance left between us, no courtroom, no sides, just two people standing in the same truth, seeing the same thing from opposite directions. No, he said quietly, this is where it starts. And that difference mattered, because change implies something is ending. But this was not an ending. It was an entry point into something much larger, something that had been moving long before either of us understood it. I exhaled slowly, steady, controlled, because for the first time since this began, I was not trying to catch up. I was choosing where to step next. Then we give them what they expect, I said, my voice clear now, certain, but not in the way they planned. And he nodded once, not approving, not instructing, just aligning. And that was enough. I turned back toward the exit, the quiet corridor stretching ahead, no longer uncertain, no longer unfamiliar, just a path, one I was choosing to walk. And as we stepped back into the night, the air felt different, not lighter, not safer, just clearer, like I could finally see the shape of what I was up against. The city lights in the distance no longer looked like something I belonged to. They looked like something I needed to navigate, carefully, deliberately, because every move mattered now. Every choice carried weight. And as I reached for the car door, I paused for just a second, not out of hesitation, but out of awareness, because this was the moment that separated who I had been from who I was becoming. And I understood that fully now. I was not the prosecutor anymore, not in the way I used to be. I was something else, something they had not accounted for. And that was exactly where I needed to be. I opened the door, slid into the driver's seat, and this time when I started the engine, it did not feel like escape. It felt like direction, like intention, like stepping into a role I had not chosen, but now fully accepted. And as the car pulled back onto the road, the silence between us was no longer heavy. It was focused, filled with everything that was about to happen next. Because this was not about running anymore. It was about rewriting the pattern they thought they understood, and I was finally ready to do exactly that. And if there is one thing this story leaves behind, it is this. The world will always try to define you before you even understand yourself. It will place you into roles, expectations, systems that feel absolute, but they are not. They are only as strong as your willingness to stay inside them. And the moment you question them, the moment you step beyond what is expected, everything changes, not because the world becomes easier, but because you finally see it for what it is, and from that moment on, you have a choice, to remain predictable, or to become something they cannot control. So pay attention to the patterns in your own life. Question what feels too certain, and when the moment comes, do not be afraid to step outside of what you were told you had to be, because sometimes survival is not about staying safe. It is about becoming untraceable.